Good morning. This is Pastor Stewart Waterhouse with 10 minutes after midnight. Today's episode is on human sacrifice in Hawaii. And I'm broadcasting to you somewhere from the jungles of Hawaii. Human sacrifice is a subject that, too often people find it revolting, or they think they have to outright condemn it. But in reality, that's the wrong approach. Rather, we should understand it. We don't have to pass judgment. The facts of history are the facts of history, and it's what makes us up today. So by understanding history, we understand today. And human sacrifice is the basis of most religion. And so, understanding it helps us understand our religions and our own beliefs. Why Hawaii? Well, I picked Hawaii for several reasons. One, Hawaii was isolated for thousands of years, so I think the practice in Hawaii would have been preserved over time, dating way back to the proto-religions of mankind, and at least one of the earliest we could get to. And yet at the same time, it was practiced all the way up to modern times, as Hawaii was rather late to come into the modern world. And therefore, we have eyewitness accounts and descriptions of it. So it's much easier to understand, and as I said, it also dates way back into the beginning of antiquity. So it's a good classic model to study. I myself am an amateur archaeologist, specializing in the anthropology of religion, in particular human sacrifice in the Bible and in Hawaii. And most of my knowledge in this comes from my own study, my own research, my own exploration, climbing mountains, going into caves, visiting ancient Hawaiian temples. And of course, some of it's passed down through, my dad, my uncle, other people I know. One of my ancestors was on the ship with Captain Cook. And I remember at Hikiauhea, when my dad visited there with me, he told me how his dad had moved a stone, revealing a pit on the altar, of which you could still see the bones of one of the people that was buried in there, that had died on Captain Cook's ship. And of course, when Captain Cook brought it ashore and buried it, the kahunas that oversaw that heiau would have interpreted it as Captain Cook bringing a human sacrifice. And exploring in Makaha Valley, I go up to the upstream all the way to the source of the water, which is a waterfall that comes off Mount Kaala. And when you get to the source, you can see ancient steps carved into the cliff going up to a little pool a little bit higher than the stream, which the waterfall lands in. And you climb these ancient carved steps. It's not very far, it's a small climb, but as you do it, you can look and you can see even more ancient carved steps that are totally worn out in the wall, and it had been climbed repeatedly over 1,000 years, and quite possibly several thousand years. And at the pool there's a ledge, and I found on the ledge a piece of pumice, lava rock. It only comes from one source, but it floats. It's lightweight. But the pumice could be used to rub on your arms, and it would shave all the hair off your arms, or whatever. And so the kahunas used this pumice. They took the body that was to be sacrificed up to the source of the water, and then they used the pumice to clean the body, shaving all the hair off and everything, making it ready to be presentable into the heiau being an ancient temple. And so these are discoveries I saw and I witnessed with my own eyes. and I researched as to what they meant and what they are. So what I'm going to talk today is really, I don't think we have time to get in depth, but we're going to do an overview, and we're going to have to talk about the religion, we're going to have to talk about the heiaus, we're going to have to talk about the source of the religion, the founders. You know, Hawaii, when the missionaries came, they thought that they worshipped the Trinity, and there were many similarities to that of the Bible. But of course they made a mistake. Hawaii had two religions that were principal competing religions. The worship of Kani. Of course Kani had his companion Kaniloa, but you had Kani, which did not practice human sacrifice, and it was mostly an agricultural religion, very simple. Kani's heiaus didn't have any walls around it, it was just a platform. It did have a big rock representing Kani just outside of the heiau. And, you know, if there was famine, they could take a fish and tap it on the side of the rock to let Kani know that they were hungry, that they weren't catching any fish, the crops weren't growing. You know, if a couple was infertile and couldn't have children, there was a ceremony. They'd go sit in front of Kani, you know, the big rock, pohaku. Pohaku is the Hawaiian word for rock. And, you know, the rock would be covered with a tapa cloth, and it would be anointed with coconut oil, and there'd be a ceremony. They'd uncover the rock and so forth, and the couple would become fertile thereafter. But the competing religion was brought by Pa'ao. And that religion had two gods, Ku and Lono. And of course, as I said, this wasn't a trinity because there were two separate religions. But Ku and Lono was the agricultural god, and Ku was the warrior god. Of course, Ku also, fishermen venerated Ku too, and so it wasn't strictly warrior. Ku represented justice and uprightness. You know, and at different seasons of the year, the different god was preeminent. So during the agricultural season, of course, everybody worshipped Lono, and when it was time for wars, people worshipped Ku. And Pa'ao brought these two, at least so it was believed, to Hawaii. And Pa'ao came from Kahiki. And in Hawaiian, kahiki just means elsewhere. You know, there's a mix-up in the Hawaiian language between the K and the T, like is it Kamehameha or Kamehameha, and so forth. Our state legislators settled that for a while back, but because of this mix-up, some people thought kahiki is Tahiti, and maybe it was, but quite probably not. And in any case, we don't know where Pa'ao came from, just from elsewhere, Kahiki. And he brought his religion. Now, there's a lot of stories about Pa'ao, and if you look them up on the internet or in books and you read those stories, remember, you can't believe everything you read. And one of the reasons is because most of the wars throughout history, from Pa'ao's time until present, between the chiefs and between the islands, were religious wars between the two competing religions. As the worship of Ku spread across the islands, of course, those who followed Kani resisted. It wasn't until more modern times, under Kahekili, that the two religions had become homogenized into one religion. But prior to that, it was very distinctly two religions, and maybe even more, but two primary. The worship of Pele, the volcano goddess, was more of a localized cult. It wasn't part of the mainstream religion. And so, when Pa'ao came, his religion was much more complex and much deeper in its theology. And the stories then, of course, that those who resisted would have made about him would have been in order to discredit him, right? So you have the story how, I think it was Pa'ao's brother accused Pa'ao's son of stealing vegetables from his garden. So in the story, Pa'ao has his son cut open to expose the contents of his stomach to prove to his brother that in fact his son would have never been a thief. And, you know, these are kind of brutal stories, but they're meant to discredit Pa'au, so I wouldn't believe them as true. You have to make distinguishes in history from the various legends as to the context in which their legends developed. Of course, there is some people that believe Pa'au may have been Christian and he fled to Hawaii, fleeing persecution from wherever Kahiki was. And this is possible. The cave where Pa'au's bones are found is associated with Wa'ula heiau in Puna, and it's now covered by lava, the cave and the heiau. But at Pa'au's bones in that cave is a crucifix, so perhaps. Pa'au is credited with introducing human sacrifice because the worship of Ku very much had human sacrifice. But did Pa'au do this, or if he was Christian, probably not, but very definitely Pa'au's descendants did practice human sacrifice and introduce it across all the islands as his religion took over throughout the islands. But then where did human sacrifice actually come from? Well, Pa'au, you know, he was a botanist. He collected plants, and when he built Wa'ula heiau, that's, you know, his temple, he had 40,000 holes dug around the heiau. Each hole would be one plant from every plant that Hawaii has throughout the islands, which I guess they believed there was 40,000 of them. The number is quite literal. And so Pa'au's heiau became known as the Lua Kini, Lua meaning hole, and Kini is 40,000. And then human sacrifices later on, their heiaus were called Lua Kinis, and so I will use the word Lua Kini to refer to a human sacrifice heiau, which in particular heiaus dedicated to Ku. Now, human sacrifice probably, even though it's credited to having come from Pa'au because all Pa'au's descendants practiced it, most likely it came from Mo'okini heiau. After Pa'au built Wa'ula, he went up to Hawaii, Hawaii, and Mo'okini heiau was already there, but he had joined forces with the kahuna from that heiau, and that kahuna most likely practiced human sacrifice. And so human sacrifice was probably a minority religion in Hawaii, indigenous to Hawaii, predating Pa'au, and Mo'okini heiau would have been the source. And Pa'au then became the kahuna at that heiau, Mo'okini, and remodeled the heiau and so forth. Now, why did Pa'au join forces? Well, what had happened is, after Pa'au arrived here, he kind of minded his own business, but he apparently was pretty influential. Nonetheless, he didn't really seek to spread his religion. He minded his own business quite a bit. But the chief, you see, heiaus are sacred. When you go into heiau, you can't commit murder. And the local chief on Hawaii Island did just that. He went into a heiau and he murdered somebody. And so that would be a threat to the religious community. And but how could they remove the chief? They needed help and they needed assistance. They needed to unite everybody in Hawaii Island to remove the chief. And so they went to Pa'au, and we don't know who they are, but I'm going to assume it might be the kahuna from Mo'okini heiau in Hawaii. Went to Pa'au and asked for Pa'au's help and said, look, we need to unite and remove this chief. And because he had committed great heva meaning sin or wrong. And at first Pa'au didn't join forces. He said, you know, this sacrilege was done against God. Let God take care of the problem himself. And of course then to get Pao's cooperation, they told the story about the canoe going across the channel, and when you joined forces, it was more likely to succeed. And Pao agreed with the reasoning and joined forces. The chief was removed. Then Pao went back to Kahiki and brought Pili, a replacement chief, which would not have been indigenous to Hawaii. He was brought from Kahiki, somebody Pao knew. And again, we don't know where Kahiki was. It was elsewhere. And so then that chief had descendants, and those descendants were known as the Pili chiefs versus the indigenous chiefs. Most of the indigenous chiefs throughout all of Hawaii then would have worshipped Kani. The Pili chiefs would have been worshipping Ku and Lono. And so then you have the competing religions. And the human sacrifice would have crept in from the forces that Pao had aligned with out of Mo'okini Heiau. And so then as Pao's influence spread, so did the practice of human sacrifice. Now, prior to Kani, we don't really know when Kani came to Hawaii or the history of it. Is it indigenous to Hawaii? I mean, very much it was later in history, but did the religion develop in Hawaii, or was it brought by somebody even prior to Pao? We don't know. We don't know. But we do know there was another god prior to both called E. And E, of course, is known as the creator god. And, before that, everything was night. Po is the word for night in Hawaiian. And E creates the flash of light, and creation emerges. And then, of course, after E, Kani comes on the scene, and then later Ku and Lono come on the scene. And so not much known about E, but E also survived a little bit more toward modern times. There's a famous heiau in Kauai that was dedicated to E. According to modern archaeologists, it's the only one, but according to my own research, the worship E was spread throughout all the islands, and just because, and Kani recognized E as well. So the other religions also recognized E as having a legitimate claim. It just wasn't widespread because, Kani was the more down-to-earth practical that they were practicing in their day-to-day life. But you take the heiau in Pokai, that's pronounced in modern language, Pokai, Bay in Waianae, Hawaii. And that heiau, modern archaeologists say, was a navigation heiau where they could learn the stars so they could navigate the oceans. They very much navigated by stars. But modern archaeologists are wrong. That heiau probably would have been dedicated to E, hence the name Po, the night. Ka is the, and then E, Pokai, E. And see, here's the thing. The navigation heiau for the stars was near Wahiawa, right next door to the birthing heiau. And that is pretty much the center of the island of Oahu where that heiau was built. Now, it would be very important if you were navigating by the stars that you learned the star charts, which you had to memorize in your mind, from the center of the island, because if you were a little bit off, you're navigating by stars, you're navigating at night. You might sail past the island and never see it, and if your navigation was slight in error. So by learning the stars from the center of the island, if your navigation had a little bit of error, you'd still hit the island, right? There's room there for that. If you learned the navigation on the edge of the island and you had slight error, you could just sail right past. So it didn't make sense that that heiau would be a navigation heiau. And of course I did know the last kahu for that heiau, even though the heiau was long since abandoned. The last kahu, I was at his funeral actually when he died. And he told me some of the secrets. And, the kahus never told the secret on their heiau. So you could ask away and they wouldn't tell you, because that would destroy the power of their particular angle of their insights into God. And they wouldn't do that. So They would never tell you that. But they didn't mind telling you about the competing heiaus and other heiaus on the island and other kahunas, right? They didn't care at all. So you could learn, not directly, but indirectly, through the direct sources. And for example, there's another heiau undiscovered, but I found it up in the upper Waianae Valley. And it's a luakini. The walls are quite thick. And I think at the front it was 14 feet high, I measured. So it was substantial, but it was still a small heiau. And one of the interesting things is a line where the rocks kind of meet up funny, making the wall. And I just puzzled over that for a long time. Why would they have an imperfection in the wall? It just didn't make sense to me. But then a kahuna shared to me that basically there was an ancient tsunami and this huge eel was washed ashore, and a famous Hawaiian warrior killed the eel and slayed him at this heiau. And the heiau was built to that. And then, of course, the head of the eel was planted and it grew up a coconut tree. And now things begin to make sense. When I was snorkeling in the ocean there off of Nanakuli, I saw two eels fighting. And I saw how the one eel raised up, kind of like you'd imagine two snakes fighting. And he actually raised up, and the angle and everything matched that imperfection in the wall of the heiau. Basically, that imperfection was a symbol of an eel. A fighting eel. He's raised up, and that's what. So it was not an imperfection. It was intentionally built into the wall to represent the eel, which now I knew the story of the origin of this heiau. And the heiau's pretty well reserved. When you go in the heiau and you look at, there's niches in the wall on the inside. These niches is where the skulls of the various human sacrifices would have been placed, because they were the witnesses to the ceremonies that were taking place. You see, they needed witnesses, and these skulls would be the witnesses, right? And of course, part of the bones from the human sacrifice would be put in the luakini, which I mentioned earlier, and that would be in the middle of the altar. Well, it's a platform, not the altar. The altar itself was built out of wood and long since gone, but it would have been placed in front of the platform, and then the platform would have had the Anu Tower, okay? And at the base of the Anu Tower, underneath it, would have been the pit, the lua, and that would have the bones from some of the human sacrifice in there. And of course, then the pit would have represented the underworld. You know, if you went deep enough, would be Milo, which could equate to hell, but hell meaning just Hades or the underworld. And then, of course, at the ground level, would be the earth, and then as you go up into the tower, you see you're going into 3 different levels of heaven, and the kahuna would go up into the tower to communicate with God. Of course, prayers would be made next to it. The heiaus for Ku had only a single, much bigger tower, and the tower was just a wooden frame with a white tapa cloth covering it for a wall, you know, kind of like a tent that way. But then the heiaus built to Lona would have 2 towers, and they'd be much smaller, one on each side of the altar. And but the luakini for Ku only had the one. And of course, then in the heiau you'd have other furnishings. You know, you'd have the imu oven that would be used to cook the flesh off of the bones of the human sacrifice. You would have the small holly or hut in there that would contain the drum, because during the services, you know, they would have the drums going, pahu. And they had one holly in there that would contain the umbilical cord, which was probably made out of seaweed. That was kind of like a ribbon cutting ceremony, if you will, equate it to a modern practice when something is dedicated, you know. And then of course they kept it in the holly, and it was considered the umbilical cord from that heiau. But and so these were the various type of furnishings in the heiau. And again, as I said, heiaus were sacred. A human sacrifice was never killed in the heiau. If the body for the human sacrifice was brought into the heiau alive, it stayed alive until it died naturally. It was never killed. Bloodshed was strictly forbidden in the heiau, which is why females could not go into the heiau, because females had the menstrual periods, so no blood would be allowed in a heiau. You know, and so the human sacrifice was usually killed outside of the heiau, and we'll get into that in a minute. But so this is what a heiau looked like, and of course I talked to the last kahu from the line of kahunas, direct descendant of Pa'au, because I knew him well at Wa'ula heiau in Puna. And again, he wouldn't tell me about his heiau, although when pressed, he's the one that did talk to me about the crucifix with the bones of Pa'au. Of course, he would go into that cave once a year. He buried his grandmother, the last kahuna for the heiau. He still went to the heiau once a year and did some ceremonies too, because he was taught, you know. But he never passed it on to his children and never told them any of the secrets. But he, of course, did tell me the secrets of competing heiaus, so that's how I learned a lot. And he buried his grandmother, the last kahuna, at that heiau, in the heiau. Now, when it was passed on from generation to generation, they actually skipped a generation every time. The kahuna would teach the religion to his grandchild, who would become the next kahuna, not to his child. So it skipped everyone, and that helped preserve the facts of the religion, because there would only be half as many as is passed on, you know. And also, it gave the kahuna a greater base to draw from. He could pick the brightest of his grandchildren, which would give him a much larger pool of children to draw from than just, say, his own children to pass his knowledge on to. And back to the eel. One thing that was important about the eel too that we should remember is the eel has the backbones in the eel, you know, from the spine, and each backbone becomes symbolic of a generation of the history. But in this case, it's kind of like the Babylonian Tiamat. It's the history of the uncreated realm, of the night, of the vastness of the ocean. The ocean represents the uncreated realm, as does the darkness. And so that history is preserved in the eel, right? And it becomes, and it's very much preserved in astrology, if you study astrology with Hydra, you know. But, so these things are very fascinating. And anyway, the Lokini heiaus had the rock walls, versus you could see the other heiaus did not, and therefore you could easily distinguish the Lokini heiau. Wa'ula heiau, just before it got covered by the lava, was not the original one, because back in prehistory, maybe 500 years ago, or I'm not saying that date, but way back, lava flow came again and threatened the original location of Wa'ula heiau. And so the ancient Hawaiians took every rock and rebuilt the heiau exactly the same, moving it to another spot outside of the lava flow, thus saving the heiau. And you see that happening quite a bit, and because these rocks that built it, the Pahakus, were very sacred. In fact, at Wa'ula heiau, Pa'au brought one rock from Kahiki, and it was incorporated into the wall of the heiau, and therefore tying it to his source. And many heiaus were that way. A rock would be traveling from a long distance to tie it to a source to be put into the building structure. And let's see what else we got. So these are the heiaus. You know, archaeologists have Wa'ula wrong because they have the holy stone inside the heiau, which is a sacrificial rock. They're actually outside of the heiaus, as you can see on every other heiau. One good example of a holy stone would be Pu'omahuka heiau in Pupukea on Oahu. And I grew up, by the way, just less than 2 miles from that heiau. At least as a child I did. And That was a very principal heiau with a very rich history and extremely important to Christianity, to the Hawaiian religion, to everything. Back to Wa'ula heiau. What does the word mean? Well, modern archaeologists translate it as red mouth, meaning the blood from the mouth from the human sacrifice, you know. But as I stated earlier, they tried to avoid sacrifice in a way that didn't produce blood. Okay, so that is totally a misconception based on Western ideas for the translation. The heiau would have a cave associated with it, and in that cave, of course, some ceremonies would take place, and that's where all the kahunas back to the beginning would be buried in that cave. And the mouth of the cave was red from red lava rock, okay? So by red mouth, it was actually referring to the cave, which would be the inner sanctums of the heiau, if you will, although the cave wasn't actually at the heiau. But then again, as I said, the heiau had been moved. So the mean of red mouth is totally different. It didn't mean, you know, the French artists, when he visited Hawaii, as I said, we actually have witnesses to human sacrifices and descriptions. And so the French artist drew out one of the human sacrifices that he witnessed. And what you see is the person being sacrificed, he's on a plank, and the top of the plank is on a rock, and then he's tied up on the rock. And so you don't really see in his depiction the ropes too much. You might see a little bit, but you see a kahuna holding his feet, and you see the grimace in the kahuna's face is holding his feet because he knows what's happening, of course. You see on the other side of him kneel down the chief kahuna, which is officiating this human sacrifice, and of course the victim is laid out on the plank there, restrained. And then you see another kahuna holding a club up over top of his head. And so it appears to be, unless you study the picture very closely, that the human sacrifice, they're going to bash his head, right? And so then you'd have the blood coming out of the mouth and everything. The head would be bashed open, and the sacrifice would be killed. And so that's how modern people interpret it when the drawing came back to Europe and people saw it, because they didn't really understand what they were looking at in the depiction. But that's not what was happening with the club. The point of the warrior or kahuna warrior holding the club was to tell the victim to cooperate with the human sacrifice, or a fate much worse awaited you. So if the victim ruined the human sacrifice, then they would take retribution on him. He'd be smashed or killed, perhaps, but he'd be ruined as a human sacrifice, right? So basically it was just, you know, submit to your fate, or your fate will be worse, okay? And when you look real closely then in the drawing, you'll see that there is a cord around his neck, okay? And then this cord goes, which you can't see in the drawing, but I've seen it in the rocks when I examined the human sacrifice rocks. The cord goes through a hole in the rock, both sides, from around the neck, through a hole into the rock, and then the officiating kahuna has a small piece of wood on that cord, and he's winding that piece of wood so that the cord is tightening, and the sacrifice is then dispatched or killed by suffocation, strangulation actually, the word is strangulation, as the cord tightened around his neck. And that's how he was killed. And then of course there would be no blood or anything, and he'd be perfect to be presented as a human sacrifice. Human sacrifice could be already dead or alive. In this case, this is how they killed a human sacrifice victim. Now there was one other way that they could kill the human sacrifice victim, and that would be through drowning. So they didn't have to strangulate, they could drown. And again, you know, you see the drowning rock, and I don't know what it's called, I just know that's what it is. Outside of a lot of little kini heiaus, there would be a bowl-shaped depression in the top of the rock where some water would be. Most likely it would be seawater from when the sea was disturbed, so that, you know, you had like white caps on the sea, and they'd take that water and put into the rock. And then they would put the sacrifice victim's head into the bowl of water, the pool of water that was on top of the rock, and drown him. You know, you don't need but a few inches to drown somebody. And when the head goes into the water, you know, it would displace some of the water, and the water would run down the outsides of the rock. And on these rocks, you would see ridges, which would mimic, say, the ridges of the cliffs of Oahu. You know, the Ko'olau cliffs have a lot of ridges in them, and other cliffs on other mountains too. And when you see the water coming down waterfalls and all these ridges, you know, the crops are going to grow. Fertility is going to happen. Because the rains brought, you know, the agricultural growth. Well, what you're seeing is a replay of this when they drown the human sacrifice by putting his face into that water. The water is displaced and comes down the ridges on the side of the rock. But it's a fertility, but even more than agricultural fertility, because it represents birth of the new life. So that, like before the baby's born, the woman's water breaks and you see the water come out. And that's what it actually represents. But then, of course, with this new birth, it's a new birth of life and of agriculture and of everything, you see. It wasn't a death rite at all. It was a new birth rite. So, and you see Hupuloa, a sacrificial rock at the top of Schofield on Oahu. You know, if you go through Kolikoli Pass, and then it's a short hike up to that famous rock, and you see the big depression there. You see the rock has a ledge halfway up the rock where the victim would kneel on that ledge, and then his face would be pressed down into to be drowned, and then the water would come down the edges. And now this would be different than the Holy Stone. Each part of so you have the rock you would see, say at Kaniaki, Heiau, and Makaha. You can see it just before you reach the Heiau when you hike up the path to it, which is right there at the top of the valley. And there's a hole, so it kind of looks like the handle on a coffee cup, you know. But that hole, through that handle-looking thing, is where the strangulation cord would be run. And, or you could see, as I said, Hupuloa, sacrificial rock in Kolikoli Pass, was for drowning. And if you go up to Mo'okini, Heiau, and Hawi, I saw both rocks on the outside of the Heiau. So apparently they use both methods there. Possible they could also just break the neck at Mo'okini Heiau, making a third method. But then you also see at Mo'okini Heiau the Holy Stone as well, which in that case is a big flat stone, because it would be considered a feminine stone since it's flat. But the human sacrifice victim would be placed on that stone. And you see that at the Heiau and Pupukea, Pu'omahuka. That's the famous rock I talked about being the Holy Stone. It's behind the Heiau, just before the overlook of Waimea Valley, and it's a big rock. You can't miss them. These holy rocks were probably rocks Takani before Ku took over and rebuilt and repurposed the Heiaus and put a rock wall around them, and then the rock Takani became the Holy Stone, which became a human sacrifice stone. Kani himself, of course, would have condemned such a thing. But we really don't know what the human sacrifice stone did. It's prominent in all the Luakini Heiaus. And as I mentioned, some of the lesser stones which were used for killing the victim, the human sacrifice stone was much more prominent. Possibly after the victim was cooked in the imu oven, so that the flesh could be taken off, he's put on the holy stone, and that's where they remove the flesh. And that's what I think. But that's not necessarily all it was used for. They could have also done some divinations with the human sacrifice body. It was quite probable, and those divinations quite probable would take place on the Holy Stone. So that talks a little bit about the Heiaus and their furnishings. And it's interesting, you know, the Luakini Heiau could only be built by the high chief of the island, not by any chief. And When it was built, so they couldn't build that many of them because only the high chief could build it, and it was a real process that the whole island had to partake of. And during the dedication ceremony, the whole island had to be 100% quiet. Okay, the chicken would have to have his beak tied shut, because if the rooster crowed, it would destroy. They'd have to start the dedication ceremony all over again. So sometimes it might take 10 years to get it dedicated, and of course, whoever destroyed the dedication had started. I'm sure he had pretty bad retribution. But and then of course the kahuna would travel around the whole island with his assistant kahuna, and there would be an ahu altar as he went into the different districts. I actually think the silence was probably not simultaneous, but in each district as the kahuna made the travel around. And that would make more sense. But I'm not quite sure either way. And of course then the kahuna's assistant would be naked, but he would have red clay smeared across his whole body, covering him up, right? And then he would collect the offering or tax at each ahu as he went through that district, and he would be announcing the heiau's dedication and going the full route. And on an island big like the island of Hawaii, it would take quite some time. You know, maybe Maui would take less time. But yeah, these are how the heiaus were built. Now the heiau service, you know, they would sit on the outside of the heiau to watch the service, you know, the people that attended. Only the kahunas would be inside doing the ceremony. And maybe some political, like the chief or chief's son and so forth. Usually the kahuna that was naked but had the red clay spread on him was an honorary kahuna appointment. And that usually, to be honorary, meant that they were appointing the chief's son as a kahuna for these purposes. And so he was the honorary kahuna. He was second in command. And probably that's why he ranked so high, because he was the chief's son. But the highest ranking would have been the kahuna nui, and that would have been chosen by his grandfather, going all back to Pa'au. So it wouldn't have been the chief's, you know, blood relation at all, because Pili was brought, and then his descendants. They both came from Kahiki, but they're still two separate families. And then of course you had now, for the chief, when their child was born, they'd have to be born at the heiau, dedicated as a child at the heiau, or they couldn't be royal. They would lose their status of being the chief's inheritance. That was apparently both in the worship of Kani and in the worship of Ku. So, you know, the heiau in Waiawa, the birthing heiau, was for royalty, and that was for the royalty of the indigenous chiefs, not Pili. And Kamehameha tried to be both, you know, and he attempted to have his wife make it to that heiau to give birth, and it didn't happen. She didn't make it in Waiawa. But then you had the competing heiau for Kus, which would be for different purposes, war heiau, but it was also a birthing heiau. So Pu'omahuka heiau in Pupukea, the Pili chief's sons that would then later become chief in their place would be born at Pu'omahuka, and they would do the ceremonies there. So, and you know, there'd be human sacrifices at different parts of the raising of the child, like when he could pee in an arch for the first time. That was a great step in the child's development, and there would be human sacrifice to celebrate it. And that would take place, of course, at Pu'omahuka, because that was the sacrificial heiau. Connie never would have done that in Waiawa. But, and we'll get back to Pu'omahuka a little bit later, because it becomes very interesting. And then the other ceremonies in the heiau sacrificial system is the human sacrifice. The audience would be seated outside, and the rock walls would add a lot of mystery to the ceremony, because the audience couldn't see everything that was going on. They could probably see the shoulders of the kahuna, especially if the kahuna went up on the platform, you know, which was like the most holy spot of the heiau. Then he'd be standing a little bit higher and could be seen much better. But so they could see some of what was going on, but not everything. So it did present a lot of mystery and a lot of theatrics. Hawaiians were not cannibals, you know, like in New Guinea and Fiji and places there are cannibals, but not Hawaii. However, as part of the religious ceremony, there was an exception, but I wouldn't call that cannibalism. So what would happen is the body of the human sacrifice, the second in command, kahuna, would use the tip of his spear, and it would probably be a ceremonial spear, scoop out the left eyeball and consume it. So you could see him holding it up. The audience could see part of the ceremony. They'd see that part of it, see him consume the eyeball. Well, in the Hawaiian religion, it's believed that the human spirit resides behind the eye. And so he's consuming where the soul of the human sacrifice victim was. And basically he's gaining the insight, he's gaining the sight, the eyeball, of that sacrificial victim, and thus the insight from that sacrificial victim. And one reason that insight would be important is because there were several types of reasons a person would get sacrificed, and we'll go into that. But one of the types of sacrifices would be the first fruit sacrifice. So like in a battle, the first person killed would be the first fruit of that war, right? And so actually both sides would have a tug of war over that body, because the side that killed that person, he wants to take it back to his heiau and present it as a human sacrifice and get God's blessing, so they would win in the battle, right? And then of course the other side would have a tug of war to keep the person killed, because they wouldn't want that to happen. And anyway, so when they brought the body back to the heiau and the eyeball was consumed, that kahuna would gain insight into the enemies, because, you know, this body came from the enemy. And then he could better advise the chief into the affairs of the war. But most of the human sacrifices, besides for fruit, would be for heva, for sin. Basically, ku represented righteousness. The stone that represents ku was always stood upright, never laying down. It would be upright, because ku is upright. Upright, symbolic word for, you know, living upright would be righteousness, right? Pono. Pono is the Hawaiian word for righteousness. And so basically, if you're punishing the wrongdoer, you're upholding righteousness before God and man, and so it's a good thing. So human sacrifice wasn't just willy-nilly. They didn't sacrifice females, by the way. This is all Hollywood. But human sacrifice was punishment for sin. And so if someone went out and killed somebody, let's say they had an accident, because there wouldn't be too many murders, you know, not with a religion like this, right? So society was very orderly and lawful. But let's say, you know, manslaughter happens, you were negligent, and your negligence ended up killing somebody, then you're guilty of a level of murder, manslaughter. And so now, because you committed to heva, your life is forfeited, and you would become a human sacrifice. Maybe you stole something, different reasons. It would have to be something important, obviously, because lesser important, there would be other punishments. But you end up becoming it. So the human sacrifice system was in a way a capital death penalty system, done in a religious setting, because you're upholding right before God. And that's very important to understand in a human sacrifice system, that is upholding righteousness, because you're punishing the wrongdoer. And even Christianity teach that, you know, that God's going to come again and all the wrongdoers are going to be punished. Yeah. So it's upholding righteousness before God. But gaining the insight, you know, there was a prophecy, and man, should I get way back into some of the ancient Hawaiian prophecies? But at Pu'amohuka Heiau, you know, the first white person to ever become a human sacrifice, William Gooch was the captain of the ship, and his astronomer for their navigation on the ship. They came into Waimea Bay off Oahu. We're talking about ancient sailing ships, right? And they needed to reprovision the ship and get fresh water for the ship. So they went ashore and they went up the river in Waimea Valley to get fresh water. And there they committed some kind of heva. We don't know what it was. But obviously, as I said, it was a requirement that to be a human sacrifice, that the victim he's being punished for his sin. So they committed some type of heva. Well, the kahuna at Pu'omohukahea, which was a warrior kahuna, by the way, his name was Koi. And from the top of the heiau, looking down into the valley, he saw him going up the river. And they captured these 3 people from the ship, the captain and the navigator astrologer, and took them back to the heiau alive. And so you can imagine they'd want to consume his eyeball and gain the knowledge of these people from elsewhere, way out, you know. And then, of course, that would be the secrets that Koi would hold, is his knowledge of these people. In this case, part of that knowledge was, as these people, Koi practiced lua, a certain type of Hawaiian martial art where they disjoint everybody so you can be folded up and put into a basket alive. You know, your arms were disjointed, your legs were disjointed, and everything. So you couldn't do nothing, you know. And so all 3 of these were taken into the heiau alive. And probably it took them 3 days to die in the heiau, because they couldn't kill them once they were in the heiau. That would be sacrilege. And they were probably hung upside down from the altar. And the kahunas would have a bowl to capture their sweat that dripped. And of course, I can imagine, you know, the ship's navigator he had studied to be a priest. He'd wanted to be a priest, and this was his fate, his end. But he had taken his Bible with him on the ship, in fact. And so I can imagine he was praying to Jesus quite a bit. And the kahunas would hear the word Jesus. And that became part of the secret knowledge of that kahuna, that these people's God was named Jesus, which is fascinating. Likewise, when Captain Cook landed at Kealakekua Bay on the Big Island, and I'm sure he conducted his funeral for his shipmate that died, that was buried inside Hikiau Heiau, and he would have had the word Jesus there too, and the kahunas there would have learned the word Jesus that Cook was praying to do. The kahunas prayed to their God, Ku, so they knew what prayer was. So this is very fascinating then. But after you know, when you hike up Makaha Valley, I spoke of that. Kaneaki Heiau, you see it at the beginning of the upper valley. So it's at the top of the valley, but the upper valley extends way up into the depths of the jungle, you know. And I found, actually, it was a friend of mine that found and then showed it to me, the original site of Kaneaki Heiau. And that Kaneaki was rebuilt using the stones from the original site. And the original site still had its human sacrifice. You could see the bones. They're still laying there when that heiau was abandoned in favor of the new one, along with some other very fascinating instruments, like a little bowl, highly polished, and things. And you know, Kaneaki Heiau, according to the modern history books, is where King Kamehameha made his sacrifices before attempting to invade Kauai. He had already invaded Oahu and conquered Oahu, and now he has to go to Kauai. That's incorrect. The site in Waianae where the Baptist church now has a Baptist camp, that is where the heiau was that King Kamehameha used. That heiau's no longer there. It's just a yard in front of a plantation house there at the Baptist compound. But that's where King Kamehameha sacrificed, not Kaneaki. So what was Kaneaki? Well, Kaneaki was built by Kahekili. And the reason I know that is because each of these heiaus had their architects that designed their heiau. And they all had the same theme, but they had certain leeways to make their own signature into the heiau too, or various deviations from the main theme. And Kahekili, the chief from Maui, when his architect signature was the backside of the heiau corner would be inset. Instead of coming like a V, it would be inset like so. So that there'd be a 90-degree angle inset. You don't see that in Kaneohe Heiau now because it's been restored, but if you look at the archaeology drawings before the restoration, you see it. Therefore, it was built by Kahekili's. There was a war as Kahekili conquered Oahu up at the top of Waianae Valley, and apparently Kahekili's side must have been camping in Makaha Valley because that heiau was rebuilt by him, obviously. And the war took place up toward Kolikoli Pass. And anyway, Kahekili ended up conquering Oahu. Later, when Kamehameha came in and united all the islands and conquered Oahu, the fact was it was an easy conquer for Kamehameha because Kahekili had already done all the difficult conquering. And then Kahekili appointed his kahuna, warrior kahuna, to Pu'o Mahuka Heiau and Pupukea. That's how Kauai ended up there. And so that's just some of the history there. So back to the heiau at the Baptist camp. One interesting thing is, prior to Kahekili appointing Koi to Pu'o Mahuka, the line of kahunas that was there was a blind kahuna who could see the future. And I don't know whether he really was blind or whether they just attributed him to being blind as part of the symbolism in him being able to have vision into the future. So whatever, this kahuna, and then of course he had his son, which according to history says his son, according to what I know about the kahuna passing on, it would have been his grandson, right? And so his grandson was going to be the next kahuna in Pu'o Mahuka, but he still was kahuna there, and he was a very, very powerful kahuna. Now, Kahekili was very much adventurous, and he wanted to unite all the islands under his command. So when King Kamehameha had this dream, Kahekili had already had it, and already done great strides toward achieving that. And but Kahekili was also treacherous. He did a lot of this through underhandedness, not through warfare. For example, the queen here on Hawaii Island, from the high chief here, visited Kahekili, and it's believed Kahekili impregnated her. And then when Kamehameha was born as her child, Kamehameha may actually be Kahekili's son. And that's quite probably true, which is why Kahekili appointed 2 guardians for the life of Kamehameha, which you see even in the symbol of the Kingdom of Hawaii's plaque symbol. You see the 2 guardians. But this is very fascinating. But so what Kahekili did is he wanted to conquer Oahu. He had the son from the high chief on Oahu raised in his court in Maui through some type of negotiation. And so when the high chief on Oahu died, then Kahekili had raised the son as though it was his own son on Maui, and he went back to Oahu and became high chief. So Kahekili thought he would, through intrigue, gain Oahu that way. And now that this fellow is chief on Oahu, as a token of subservience, as a token, he told him, look, I want you to give me this area on Oahu. It's near Kaneohe, and under the Kolau Mountains. It's today Kulo, a ranch, is at that spot. But he said, give me that area as appreciation. After all, I raised you and I held nothing back. You know, you were like my son. And the chief didn't think he had the power to do it on himself, so he had to convene a council to make it official to gift him this area. And the kahuna, which from Pu'umahukeha was a very powerful kahuna, he showed up. All the lower chiefs were afraid to speak up against this, but the kahuna did speak up against it. And the kahuna said, "Oh, chief, you can't do this because this area had the cave where all the chiefs' children were, where all the deceased chiefs were buried in this cave. So going way back 1,000 years or maybe far more. And so it's very symbolic as being the heart of Oahu. So Kahekili hadn't just asked for any piece of ground. He wanted the heart, right? This cave had several symbolic entrances. One entrance comes up on the palace grounds where the chiefs were buried in the palace ground there. Now it's kind of fenced off when you go on the palace grounds. You can see where the entrance was, but the entrance is buried, so you see a small mound. And that royal burial ground was then moved up Nuanu, where you see the current royal mausoleum. But even at that mausoleum, you go down in the entrance of the cave where the chiefs are buried in there, and it's supposed to be another entrance to the same cave. Now, whether these are all the same cave, they're symbolically the same cave, the entrances. And so the kahuna said, you're giving away Oahu sovereignty. You can't do this. And what is the chief going to do? He can't contradict his kahuna. The kahuna is powerful. So he told Kahekili with great regret. I took it to the council and I couldn't do it. I couldn't get it passed. That was overridden. So Kahekili then changed his tactic, and he told the chief that, your kahuna has betrayed you. He told you not to give it to me because he came to me in secret and offered it to me. This was a lie. But the chief had to go along with the lie, and then sometimes the chief probably knew it was a lie, but what was he going to do? There would be war otherwise, and in the end there was war, and as I said, Oahu was eventually defeated in Upper Waianae Valley. But the chief then summoned the kahuna, and of course at that time they didn't cross the Pali up over the mountains to get there. It would be a long roundabout. They'd have to go around the whole circle of the island, and so you'd go past from Pu'umahuka all the way up by Kaiana Point and on around. And when he reached Waianae, coming all the way, the chief didn't want to let him get all the way to Waikiki where his royal compound was, because he was afraid it was a powerful kahuna. So this was an ambush. The chief had select warriors waiting in Waianae. And so when the kahuna stopped at Te Heiau in Waianae, which is located now at the Baptist Church grounds, which is where later Kamehameha had actually made his sacrifices, then he was betrayed, and his son were tied up in the heiau. And tied up in that heiau, his son escaped, and his dad told him to run to the sea, and that the religion would be given to another people from overseas. Because this was a betrayal of the religion. You're taking a high kahuna and betraying him. And the only time that had happened before was, like 700, 1,000 years earlier when Pa'ao arrived, and a chief then betrayed and killed somebody in a heiau. So it's going to upset everything when this happens. And of course, he ran to the sea. His son or grandson, whichever it may be, ran into the sea. One of the chief's warriors threw the spear, striking him through the back and killing him, and he died in the sea. And so therefore, his grandson becomes the human sacrifice, sealing or ordaining the prophecy that his dad, the high kahuna, made. And of course, the kahuna was then killed and brought to Kapolei, where he was strung up, and the chief came there to meet him. And so then with the kahuna out of the way, then Kahekili could make his move on Oahu. But so these are some of the affairs as how things worked out. So if you commit a human a murder, manslaughter in this case, because there would have been very few murders, or some other very grievous crime, you could get forgiven and restored to society. The blood avenger, which would be a relative of the person you killed, could come kill you. Or the family of the person you could kill could have petitioned to the chief, and the chief would send his people to come kill you. This would be vengeance, right? You'd probably be captured and be a human sacrifice for your sin. But if you went to the heiau voluntarily and went into the heiau, prostrated yourself before the altar, waited for the kahuna to come tap you on the shoulder and then go through the ceremony, you could be forgiven and restored to society. So the heiau, every heiau was like a city of refuge. And of course they had the city of refuge, but the heiau was a mini version of that. And of course the blood avenger would know you'd be trying to make it to the heiau for forgiveness, and he might wait at the clearing around the heiau, and you'd have to make that last dash, because if he caught you before you entered the heiau, he had the right to kill you, and probably would. But if you got one foot into the heiau, you were safe. Absolutely safe. Even if it was the chief's son you killed, you were safe once you made it into the heiau, and then you could be forgiven. So it's very interesting, you know. Take you as a sinner because you committed heva, and you're trying to get to the heiau, but you're now hiding in the woods nearby the heiau. You know that the eyes are looking for you somewhere. You're going to be you're looking into the clearing, and you can see a human sacrifice on the holy stone where they're working on it. It's quite fearful, and you're scared, very much scared, because you know that's going to be you if you're caught, you know. You see the smoke coming up from the ovens. And by the way, it would be heaven to let that smoke touch you, so you wouldn't want to be downwind from the heiau. Especially at Wa'ula, that was famous there, that the smokes, I don't know if they curled around, and yeah. So you don't let the smoke touch you. But you're there hiding, and you know that the blood avenger is waiting for you somewhere, looking over that clearing too. You don't know where he's hiding, but you're also hiding. And it's very scary. But when you think you've got a safe shot, you run for all you're worth, and you get in the heiau, and you can be forgiven. And it's fascinating, fascinating. And so the system was very good, because it was not just a system of punishing wrongdoing, but it was also a system of restoring you to society. It had restoration and repentance. It's very much built into the religion. You know? And of course, we're talking about the religion of Ku. And that would have only been certain parts of the year. Other parts, Ku's partner Lono would have been preeminent, and there would be doing ceremonies for agriculture. And there may have been a human sacrifice to Lono to initiate a ceremony, but for the most part, Lono did not practice human sacrifices. It very much was Ku. Human sacrifice religion was very much a Ku religion. Now, why was the heiau so sacred? Well, the heiau was very sacred because it was considered the pre-emergent spot of creation. Okay, so the island is creation. It emerges from the sea, especially in a volcanic island, which we are. And, you know, E created order out of chaos. You know, E banished the darkness, banished the ocean. The island came up, the land, then the land had a chief that kept order and ruled over the land. It was part of the ordered realm, and that ordered realm would have been a kingdom, you see. And but that would have been established by God, okay? And so the land, the Aina, is sacred. But the very first emergent part, the heiau is symbol of that. So mythologically, the heiau was the initial emergent. And you know, part of that symbolism, when the floor of the heiau would have been white, because it would have made coral rocks paved with on the floor. You don't see that anymore, because the coral rocks have long since been stolen or repurposed by looters or whatever. You still see a lot of rock walls. Many of them were stolen too, to make rock walls for horse pens or whatever. But yeah, so the floor was white, representing, you know, the emergent land. And so when you go to the heiau, you're going directly into to the very first creation of God, you see? So that's why That's why the heiau was so sacred. And but the person that committed heva can go in there and get forgiven and being restored to society. Anyway, I hope this gives you a broad overview on the human sacrifice. They didn't take the virgin, you know. The human sacrifice, by the way, had to be perfect. If it was imperfect, it couldn't be, you know, you wouldn't want to present to God something that was imperfect, right? So if a person was a cripple, they were disqualified from being a human sacrifice. Because God, you're going to give God the second best? Or even worse? No. So only something perfect could be. For example, the female would not be a human sacrifice because she had the monthly blood flow. And the blood was not perfect, so the bleeding, you know, which we were very much averse to. So women were not. So by extension, you see, if a female even bit a man, and so the man had bite marks on him, then he could no longer be a human sacrifice. He's not perfect. He was bit by a female, right? So the body had to be perfect. That's why they took so much time cleaning the body before it was presented. Because you don't give God second best. But there was a tension in the religion because, remember, it was the person that committed heva that was sacrificed. In other words, it was the sinner that was sacrificed. So in a way, his soul was not perfect, because he had committed a wrongdoing. Yes, you're upholding righteousness by punishing the wrongdoer before God. So God honors that. But the sacrifice falls short of perfection. And they wanted to strive for perfection so that even if you were bit, you would be disqualified, right? Yeah, so there was that. And it's just very fascinating, very fascinating. Substitution, you know, human sacrifice could be substituted. So if you did something wrong and you had to be sacrificed now, and this happened, I'll give a case. For example, there was a warrior who was a very great warrior, and he was the favorite of the chief. I mean, the chief's total favorite. But in the heat of battle, the enemy person that he was closing in on was the club and almost got him, had fled to the heiau for safety, because it's a refuge. You can't kill somebody in a heiau. You can't drag him out and kill him either. When they get in there, they're safe. Okay? Well, the person being pursued got his foot into the entrance of the heiau. He didn't even get into the heiau yet, but his foot was in. And he didn't realize the guy's foot was in, so he went ahead and hit him over the head and killed him. But witnesses to the battle saw it, that the guy's foot was in, and therefore he should have already had refuge. And so now the warrior had committed heva. It wasn't intentional, but it was still wrong, right? So his life was forfeit. He should become a human sacrifice. But he was the chief's favorite, so the chief is like, what am I going to do? I don't want to kill my favorite person or have him killed, right, by the mu. That mu is the people that went and killed the human sacrifice victim. So you could substitute. But you couldn't substitute and give God something less. You'd have to substitute something greater. Otherwise, you're cheating God, right? You can't cheat God. So in the substitutionary process, you'd have to substitute something better, something higher. So the only substitute could be used would be the chief's own son, right? The chief would have to have his own son human sacrificed as a substitute for his favorite warrior. You couldn't do anything else. One reason why chiefs would have several wives, so he'd have several sons to choose from. You know, he'd have a spare wife with a spare son for purposes such as this. But yeah. And so on my next video blog, I'm going to talk about the human sacrifice of Jesus. And I hope my talking about Hawaiian human sacrifice helps understand a little bit of human sacrifice and what it is. And on my last blog, I talked about human sacrifice in the Bible. And in the beginning of that, I talked about the origins of human sacrifice. And now this human sacrifice of Hawaii, which represents human sacrifice, I think, as its pure form worldwide, or at least the closest to it. And so then, as I say, this will help us understand now when we get into talking about the human sacrifice of Jesus. Because Jesus was our human sacrifice. At least we as Christians believe that. So until next time, goodbye.